Hi, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Cycle of Harm, the Toxic Path of Fracked Gas, brought to you by Scenic Hudson. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, and I especially would like to thank our co-sponsors for tonight's event, Food and Water Watch, Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, NYPIRG, the Newburgh Clean Water Project, New Paltz Climate Action Coalition, Riverkeeper, Sane Energy, and Sierra Club. My name is Haley Carlock. I'm the Director of Environmental Advocacy for Scenic Hudson, and tonight we'll be presenting the second in our three-part webinar series that follows the path of damage left by fracked gas from the wellhead to the pipeline to the power plant. In our final webinar in the series, which will be coming to you later on in August, we will be specifically focusing on the proposed new Danskammer fracked gas plant in Newburgh, New York, on the shores of the Hudson River. Since we won't be speaking about it in a lot of detail tonight, I'll give you a quick rundown of what this project will mean. It will run much more often than the old existing plant that's currently on the site. It will use more fracked gas, and it will increase harmful emissions significantly, leading to a increase in climate warming greenhouse gas emissions and a more than 25-fold increase in pollutants that cause and exacerbate asthma and other respiratory illnesses. If you'd like to learn more about that proposal and why it will be harmful to our health, our communities, and our climate, and to find out how you can take action to stop it, you can visit www.stoptheplant.org. But back to this evening's agenda, we'll be discussing the impacts of natural gas transmission and all of those steps in between extracting gas from the ground and burning it for energy. From pipelines to compressor stations to wastewater storage and disposal, transporting and handling fracked gas presents unique issues. It can impact hundreds of communities over thousands of miles. It presents acute public safety dangers and environmental and human health impacts. In this way, the gas that would supply the new Danskammer plant will have impacts that reach far beyond just Newburgh or the Hudson Valley. Now, before I turn it over to our great presenters this evening, let me just go over a few quick housekeeping items before we get started. After all of the presenters tonight have spoken, we're going to save some time for questions and answers and discussion amongst our panelists. If you are viewing on Zoom, you will see at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. At any time throughout the presentations, you can pose questions through that feature, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can at the end of the program. If you are watching today on the live stream on Facebook or on YouTube, you can also pose your questions there through the chat feature. We've got folks monitoring that, and we'll also try to get as many of those to our presenters as we can before we close this evening. And now, without any further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker of the evening, Stephen D. Smith, tribal name Owl of the RAMAPO LENAPE Nation. Mr. Smith received his Bachelor of Arts in Political Science from the University of California at Santa Cruz and his JD from the University of California at Berkeley. He has taught and lectured on a wide variety of subjects, including telecommunications policy, trade policy, environmental law, and the human rights of Indigenous people. Mr. Smith has assisted Navajo, Tohono O'odham, and Guyanese villagers with major environmental issues in national courts and before Congress and the United Nations. And we're so honored to have him here with us tonight. Take it away, Owl.
Anishik Gichimanatu, Anishik Kishalamo Queen, Elamiliang, Kakana Ki, Walk, Mbi, Walk, Kashung, Walk, Tindao, Anishik, 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 Anishik. And these are words in the Munsee language, which is the original language of Manhattan in this region, including where the Danskammer plant is proposed. And actually the word Manhattan is a Munsee word. The Munsee word for the Hudson is the Mahakinatuk, where you have similar words like Mohican, Mahakinatuk. That is the river that flows both ways. And as a speaker spoke earlier in the series, it's basically an estuary up until near Albany. So a lot of the place names, a lot of the words that we don't even think about in this area are actually of indigenous origin. We, the RAMAPO Munsee Lenape Nation, remain in the area and have been here since time immemorial. And we oppose this plant and the fossil fuel infrastructure because of the damage that it's doing. What I said in English, the translation from the original Munsee language was, Anashi Gichi Manitou, thank you, great spirit, great mystery, great energy. I like the word great mystery because it's a kind of a recognition that, and this is what the Lakota call the deity or the great spirit, great mystery. I like that formulation because it's a recognition that we don't know everything, and some humility in terms of how we approach matters. We simply don't know all the consequences of what we do, so we need to approach science, anything, with a certain amount of humility and respect. And I don't think we have that now, in the sense that we have all this technology that we've developed. We don't necessarily really realize how dangerous it can be. And sometimes, in some ways, I think we're living in a valley between knowledge and wisdom. We have the knowledge to do so much, but oftentimes we don't have the wisdom to not do certain things. And the atomic bomb is a perfect example of that. Anashi Kisha Lamokwing, thank you from whose thoughts we arose. And the recognition that our thoughts themselves have a certain power. It's not just what's tangible, but the intangible world as well, or the invisible world. Elamiliang for giving us the earth. And I brought a rock from Ringwood. The portrait you see in front of you is of Torn Valley, Torn Mountain, which is part of the RAMAPO Mountains. And if you can imagine if you can go to the next slide, please. What we have here is the RAMAPO Pass. If you can imagine the Appalachian Mountains as a wall, there's certain passageways into the interior. You know, one of those being the RAMAPO Pass. This is where the Appalachian Mountains come closest to the ocean. And with all due respect to Philadelphia and Boston and other cities, this is a reason, this geography, why Manhattan became such a world center, a world nexus. And that is because when you had the Erie Canal Project, Hudson River, which is where the Danskammer plant in this region, once you were able to connect the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, to the Mississippi River, up to the Missouri River, you were able to connect Europe, Africa, and South America to the interior of the continent. So the transportation of people, goods, has had a tremendous impact on not just the local history, but the planetary history as well. So sometimes I feel like we've gotten away from realizing that what we most need in the world we have right now, Kakanaki, Earth. This is iron-bearing ore from Ringwood, one of our communities that supplied iron for the Revolutionary War, the chain across the Hudson that stopped the British ships from coming up the Mahakinatuck, the Hudson River, and also the first cannonballs in that revolution. And we kind of forget that history and the fact that in some ways, the pass, the RAMAPO Pass, which was the only land bridge to the interior, was significantly responsible for the success of the American Revolution, because the British had to remain a naval power. They could never really establish control over the land like they had the sea. And we, the RAMAPO people, were the ones that knew the pass and shared that knowledge with the revolutionaries. That's something that's kind of hidden in the history. Anashikambi, water. It's not so much that we have rights to water, which we do. I mean, we are water. I mean, 60% of our bodies is water. And it's no coincidence that the poisons we put into the air and the water eventually end up inside us ourselves. I mean, we are water. I mean, in the movie Gasland, I think it was Josh Fox was able to light the water on fire. And to me, the idea that anyone would continue to want to frack after knowing that it leads to such dire pollution that we can light our water on fire, I mean, that's beyond my comprehension in some ways. Air, Anashik Kashun. I mean, sometimes it's like a fish. You know, how does a fish know it's wet? I mean, that's the environment that we're in. So the air is in us and around us as well. And to me, what's interesting about this COVID crisis, the virus, is that we're seeing names, and it really does. It affects me. I mean, I think it affects everyone that has a conscience. You know, to see people who are dying because of this. But what we don't see is that air pollution itself, I mean, there's 200,000 people in the United States that die every year because of bad air. And I think in China, it's about 1 million. And worldwide, it's 7 million people that die because of bad air every year. I mean, if the coronavirus is a pandemic or an epidemic, then this water pollution, this air pollution, of which fracking is a major contributor, including what they want to do with the Danskammer plant, that's contributing to a pandemic as well. And when we think about the water pollution, if you can go to the next slide. The RAMAPO Pass was really, or is and continues to be, a major part of our history in terms of where we're going in our survival. The RAMAPO Pass, for the reasons I mentioned, is an area where they want to bring a lot of pipelines through because it's the easiest way to move back and forth from the coast to the interior. So we have a target on our backs. We always have. And this is an example of the sacrifices and the cost to the LENAPE people of our so-called progress in this country. I mean, we have communities spread out all throughout the continent, a couple in Oklahoma, 2 in Ontario, 1 in Wisconsin. And a lot of that was because of resources that they wanted, and they didn't want us to be there. So that fractured our community and scattered us throughout the continent. So we see what the price of the so-called progress can be. If you can go to the next slide then, please. With Man versus Ford, it used to be the site of the old iron mines, and then they started just to dump untold amounts of pollution there because they didn't care about our lives. But again, it's short-sightedness because the pollution they were dumping in the Ringwood mines in the RAMAPO Mountains is at the headwaters for the Wanakee Reservoir, which supplies drinking water to millions of people in New Jersey. And even right now, they want to just cover it up. They don't even want to remove it. They don't want to remediate it. They just want to put a cap on it and say that it's okay. And we're at the headwaters of the Wanakee Reservoir. And that's just a warning that most of you all on this show already know, is you cannot take the word of the scientists and the technocrats at face value. When they say that it's okay, you've got to question them, you've got to push them, you've got to make sure that what they're saying is actually good. If you can go to the next slide. So the last element I mentioned is Anashik Tindao, which is fire. It's not so much that indigenous people are anti-technology, it's just that we have respect for technology. First technology being fire. And here I have some tobacco, which is the first plant. which we use to bring our prayers to the Creator. Oftentimes, I'll start a discussion by saying, you know, I'm Al, I'm an energy addict, I'm a fossil fuel addict. I admit that. And sometimes I like to say, you know, start my own 12-step fossil fuel addiction program. And along those lines, I say, you know, we have to admit that there's a problem, that we're powerless to solve that problem by ourselves, which is why, you know, Indigenous people were respectful and were conscious of the Great Spirit, so to speak. And then take a fearless inventory of where we're at and where we're going. And I'll just leave you with some lessons from the Navajo Nation. I had the great pleasure of meeting Roberta Blackgoat, a grandmother from the Navajo Nation, and heard her speak. And she was talking about how coal is the liver of the earth. I thought it was just an interesting metaphor until I found out that coal is a carbon-based compound, it's a chemical element, and it has certain filtering properties that are unique amongst you know, elements. And finally, I'll just leave you with a quote from Joe Shirley Jr., the past president of the Navajo Nation. And he said, I was raised by my grandmother, and she told me, do not forget our teachings. One of the teachings is, grandson, is that we are all on the same side. We are all members of what is called the five-fingered intelligent earth dweller called Homo sapiens humankind. It does not matter your color, whether you are white, black, Asian, Hispanic, or Native American. We are all on the same side. The evil monsters, grandson, know no creed, no color. It does not say, this is a white man, we will spare the white man, and we will devour the Native American. It does not distinguish, it devours everyone. It preys on everybody. The monsters are famine, thirst, greed, jealousy, ignorance, bigotry, racism, apathy, and I would add hydrofracking and Danskammer, and all manners of diseases. And this is what we're dealing with here. We're dealing here with people who place profit above our health. And that's a monster in itself. Not them, but what they're doing. And these are the real monsters. And we ought to be standing side by side, making war against these monsters. They are all alive. They are essences out there. It's just that we do not see or know them. So Anashik, for listening to this presentation and for taking action to stop this kind of madness. Anashik, thank you.
Thank you so much, Owl, and what profound words to end on your presentation. The RAMAPO LENAPE tribe has done some wonderful work in advocating against these kind of harmful fossil fuel infrastructure projects. I first worked with them on the Pilgrim pipeline, which was actually not a natural gas pipeline, it was an oil pipeline, but the power of the folks in the tribe coming together against such a destructive force is just such a powerful thing to see. And we're so grateful to have you and the RAMAPO Nation as a partner in this fight. Moving on to our next speaker tonight, we have Kim Frachek, the director of Sane Energy Project, which is a decade-old organization focused on halting fracked gas infrastructure and hastening a rapid and just transition to renewable energy that is community-owned or led. Kim spearheads imaginative strategies with resistance communities across New York State to instill activism with a spirit of community and joy. She is committed to using art as a tool for social engagement and has brought a wise and considerate hand to all of her ongoing work, and we're so pleased to have her with us today. Go ahead, Kim.
You can go to the next slide. So in this presentation, we're going to learn a little bit more about fossil fuel infrastructure, fracked gas in particular, residents already engaged in campaigns, elected officials, just so you can also invite them to use the tool that I'm going to introduce to you on how to teach your elected officials on what's happening in your local area. We're going to build vocabulary and insight to the fossil fuel infrastructure process and find out what's happening in our local areas. And also to understand what's happening regionally so we can know the bigger picture of the fight. Next slide. So part of the work we do at Sane Energy Project is to make sure that we can all communicate complicated narratives like our energy system to further accessibility. We believe energy, just like housing, water, healthcare, education, is a human right. And we have having accessibility to that and how these systems work is part of democratic accountability. So we use our artistic communication skills. Many artists participate with Sane Energy Project in sharing music, cultural traditions, and filmmaking, like the one you're about to see. Here's a short film that we made about our mapping project. So you can play the film. Oh, there's no sound.
And safety. However, since this grassroots victory, we've seen a massive build out of fracking infrastructure in New York State. It's important to keep the big picture in mind that just because we ban one part of the process doesn't mean we actually ban fracking. Let's start at the source. Pennsylvania still allows poisonous fracking wells despite community resistance. But from these wells is a network of pipelines that need compressors to push the gas through the pipe, which spew cancer-causing chemicals. One of the end games is to export the gas, not even serving the affected communities. There is still an effort to lock New York into a future of fracked gas by massive power plants like CPV, Cricket Valley, and smaller ones like Sheridan Hollow disguised as resilient microgrids. The frack gas infrastructure will be fed by hundreds of frack gas wells in Pennsylvania and creates a frack gas transport, storage, and waste system in New York. This web of frack gas infrastructure not only harms dozens of communities, but contributes to climate change. The industry says gas is clean, but science says frack gas is just as bad for global warming as coal. Visit the You Are Here map and get involved in a local fight so no family has to live next to fracking wells or frack gas infrastructure.
Okay, we can go back to the slideshow, slide 4. Cool. So we started as a group of volunteers who were working on getting fracking banned in New York State around 2010. And at the same time, the Spectra pipeline was proposed to come into the west side of Manhattan in New York City. A number of us who grew up in Pennsylvania and understood the detriments of the fracking industry and what was happening with drilling wanted to organize to halt this pipeline because we knew exactly what was happening on the other side of the pipeline. What we learned was that many organizations wanted us to ignore the pipeline and just focus on the drilling and get a ban on fracking. They were all telling us, don't confuse people by talking about pipelines. Just focus on getting fracking banned and we'll be okay. But we knew the pipeline was connected directly to fracking and we didn't want to frack our friends and family in Pennsylvania. So we didn't give up and we formed Sane Energy Project. Next slide. Through our commitment to focusing on stopping the pipeline, we met many other people that were also focusing on parts of the infrastructure of the fracking industry, like compressor stations, water theft from our rivers, lakes, and streams, gas storage proposals on the side of Seneca Lake, which was the drinking water source of 100,000 people, and frack waste in the southern tier. We realized that we needed to build a map so that we could visualize the breadth of the industry, so we could really understand how our regions are connected. We could see the agenda of the gas industry so we could better organize ourselves, because we knew that fracking was more than just drilling. It was the cradle to grave process, and we needed to understand it in order to beat it. Next slide. We also knew that the human story was also very important to connecting our communities and educating people and the places where people love and live and want to protect. These are a few of the people that we began to organize with. Next slide. We then met with an awesome organization called Fracked, which works on mapping projects. And we told them what we wanted to do with the information that all of our community organizing had compiled. So we put together the map and we decided to call it You Are Here, just like the map pin. On this map, there are many tools, like you can type in your address or zip code to find out what's happening in your local area. You can click on the dots to find out what an actual piece of infrastructure is to get information on it. You can minimize the legend to see the map only, or you could also watch videos of local communities telling their stories. And then you can click on download downloadable medical and science facts that we have made sure have linked to the fracking compendium from the Physicians and Scientists for Social Responsibility. It's an incredible encyclopedia that documents studies that covers all of the science and health issues with the fracking industry. Next slide. What we learned by talking to other people and hearing their stories was that their local infrastructure problem looks like and what they were trying to organize to resist to protect their health, safety, and democracy. And it wasn't just the drilling, and that's why we stuck with focusing on the comprehensive picture of the fracking industry. Next slide. So just to remind you why we're fighting back, we just wanted you to have a sort of like a big picture of how the industry is seeing our region. They're not seeing it as the places where we love to spend with our families, we love to swim, we love to live our lives. They see it as their market, as a place to dig, dump, and burn. Next slide. And we also want to remind ourselves about why fracked gas is a problem in the first place. We know that methane, which is fracked gas, is 86 times more potent a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. If we don't reduce greenhouse gases in our atmosphere in the next 9 years, we will likely pass thresholds that we will not be able to sustain life on planet Earth. Next slide. And we also know that it affects all of the systems of our living bodies: respiratory, nervous, reproductive, immune, cardiovascular, and digestive systems. Next slide. We also know that it affects our democracy. We know that many corporations will pay off politicians, and that is no good for any of us who want to be represented in our system of governance. Next slide. So we probably all know about pipelines and that people fight pipelines, but what a lot of people don't know is that gas pipelines require something called a compressor station that squeezes the gas inside of a pipeline and pushes it down the pipeline to the next compressor station. And that's how gas transmits and moves through the pipeline. They have to build them every 30 to 50 miles or where there's turns or hills. Next slide. This is a picture of the mini sink compressor station by day. And if you look very close at the blurry lines above the white roof, you can see where the emissions are coming out. And now next slide. This is what that same shot looks like through a forward-looking infrared camera. And this is spewing out all the time. And this is directly across the street from where people live, and they are getting sick. Next slide. On the You Are Here map, you're able to turn on and off layers. So if you want to look at one type of specific infrastructure, like I just did here, you can just see the compressor stations. So imagine what the emissions were from the mini sink compressor station and multiply that by all the green dots you see on the map. Next slide. We know the name of the game of the fracking industry is just to keep building more infrastructure and lock us into fossil fuels and to charge us all for it through fees, through our monthly bills, whether it's for electricity or gas and heating. And our power plants produce even a massive amount more greenhouse gases into our atmosphere than compressor stations do. So next slide. And this is what the power plants look like here. If we just turn on the power plants layer, you can see a major concentration of them around the metropolitan area of New York, which is the highest rate of asthma in children in North America in the South Bronx. Next slide. We know the name of the game is to lock the economy into fossil fuels on our dime and drive their private profit. So as long as they can build us up and keep us hooked on the infrastructure, they can also export the excess gas out there. Thank you for a 1-minute check. So we know that one of the names of the game is to export this liquefied natural gas. Next slide. We know that LNG is worse for the climate than fracked gas alone because they have to refrigerate it and transport it, and that adds on to that 86 times, 40% more. Next slide. But we know that there's some good news. We do have a wins tab on the map. And next slide. We beat the Port Ambrose LNG port in 2015, and next slide. We beat the Williams pipeline just a couple months ago in 2020. Next slide. We know that community geothermal is possible and actually happening. Next slide. For instance, St. Patrick's Cathedral in Midtown Manhattan is 100% geothermal. Everybody is so shocked when I tell them that. Next slide. Community solar projects are propping up as a way of building community resiliency. Next slide. And we know the heat pumps, not pipelines movement is growing with the Renewable Heat Now campaign. Next slide. And this is a map of heat pumps that have been installed that Frack Tracker made. So we are also building the renewable energy map. Next slide. So I just want to remind you of the way that the industry sees our region. And next slide. This is the way we see our future. And this is something that we can really build towards a sustainable and socially and ecologically responsible economy. Next slide. A couple of next steps. Following up on what Owl said, I really encourage you to also check out the native-land.ca map, which you can find. You can type in your zip code, just like on the You Are Here map, and find out the indigenous land that you are on right now. Next slide. And please look at the You Are Here map. Next slide. And also, 2 blocks from my house in Brooklyn, New York, they are building a fracked gas transmission line right now. They definitely picked the wrong neighborhood, but I encourage you to check out the No North Brooklyn Pipeline website and file a comment for us. Next slide. And please jot down my telephone number, text me, or email me anytime if you have any questions. I love to nerd out about this stuff. And I'll stop there.
Thank you so much, Kim. And you're right, they definitely chose the wrong neighborhood. They should have done a little research before they proposed a pipeline right in your backyard of all places. But it was just amazing to hear about. I loved ending on the note of all of the great and many recent victories in defeating pipelines. And it's really encouraging, particularly for those of us working on fossil fuel infrastructure in New York, to see that the state has stopped a lot of these projects. One by one, they seem to be falling. And we really hope that the Danskammer project is going to be the next one. If you're just joining us now, we just heard from Kim Frachek from Sane Energy Project. And prior to that, we heard from Owl of the RAMAPO LENAPE Nation about an indigenous perspective on what fossil fuel infrastructure is doing to our lands. And next, we're going to hear from Dr. Courtney M. Williams. Dr. Williams brings over a decade of experience in researching cancer and the molecular mechanisms of disease to parse the emerging data on health and environmental impacts of energy infrastructure and shale gas development. She's worked closely with local governments to educate them on the public health issues surrounding natural gas infrastructure, and she also sits on the City of Peekskill Conservation Advisory Council. She's a co-founder of the Safe Energy Rights Group, coordinator with Resist Spectra, and a member of the Stop Algonquin Pipeline Expansion focused on fighting the build-out of fracked gas infrastructure in the Hudson Valley. All right, Courtney, take it away.
Thanks so much, Haley. So thanks for the kind introduction. So my name's Courtney. I live in Peekskill, New York, 400 feet from the Algonquin pipeline and less than 1 mile from Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, which the pipeline runs beneath. I put these pictures up here to kind of give you an idea of how long I've been at this. So I have 2 children, and the expansion of the Algonquin pipeline runs 400 feet from their elementary school. And so when I started doing this advocacy, they were pretty little. And now you can see my daughter's the one giving the talks and protesting with me. So the groups of which I am a part are at the bottom if anybody wants to follow and find out more information. Unfortunately, this expansion is not one of the fights that we won. So there now is currently a high pressure 42-inch fracked gas pipeline running 105 feet from critical safety infrastructure at Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant. So we have joined forces with folks in Indian Point Safe Energy Coalition to try and get involved in the decommissioning process to really address the risks that this pipeline poses. Next slide, please. So Kim talked to you a little bit about the kinds of infrastructure that are involved in a gas pipeline. One thing that I think we all need to remember, and what the FLIR camera images that Kim showed really demonstrates, is that at every step of this process, methane and the contaminants within that fracked gas are leaking into the atmosphere. And the EPA has tried to do estimates of how much exactly is leaking, But we know from other studies that this is a gross underestimate of how much methane and contaminants are leaking out of these kinds of infrastructure. And that's important because not only is methane 86 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas, but there are lots of contaminants within fracked gas that have impacts on our health. Next slide, please. So Kim showed you some images from this too. So here's the Minising compressor station looked at, if you're looking at it through a regular camera. Next slide. We can visualize the amount of fracked gas that is being vented out of this compressor station. And there's nothing, quote unquote, going wrong here with this compressor station. This is kind of normal activity. This is normal functioning of the gas pipeline. This compressor station vents emissions measured in tons every year. So what is in that gas that's being emitted? Next slide, please. So here's just a sample from the Southwest Pennsylvania Environmental Health Project. And if folks are interested, I encourage them to visit their website. They have a ton of information. But here is some of the chemicals that are released by compressor stations in New York State. So this is from 2008 to 2014. And a lot of those words folks may not understand. But if you look on the right where I've drawn these arrows, what do these contaminants within the gas, what do they do to our health? So you can see many of them are respiratory irritants, particulate matter and things like that, that can lead folks with pre-existing conditions like asthma and COPD to have acute problems breathing. But also for those of us that don't have those respiratory problems, we can get irritation or coughing, things like that. We've got irritants for our mucous membranes, that's the eyes, the nose, the throat, and the lungs. Carcinogens, so formaldehyde and benzene, those are known carcinogens, as well as things that are being linked, like the particulate matter, that are linked to heart attack and asthma, and increased emergency room visits for those kinds of complaints. But I think one thing that we really need to keep in mind is who's doing the measuring here and when are they doing the measuring? So unfortunately, most of this is self-reported by the companies running the pipelines. And they do not have to do continuous monitoring. So they can choose a day, go to their compressor station, and they can measure the emissions there and report that to the Department of Environmental Conservation here in New York State, or the Environmental Protection Agency at the federal level. And I will just give you a second to guess that if you were a multi-billion-dollar gas pipeline company, would you choose to report emissions from a day that you maybe had a release of gas from the pipeline? Or would you choose a day that maybe we weren't pushing a lot of gas through that pipeline, or you had things shut down for repairs? So how much can we trust self-reported data from these pipeline companies? And I would say probably very little. Next slide, please. So if we kind of, as a researcher, the questions we need to ask in terms of these emissions, there's kind of two categories. So one would be short-term exposure. So if you're passing by a piece of infrastructure, what could happen if you breathe that in? So the acute things could be like coughing or eye irritation or a runny nose, and go to the more extreme, like having an asthma attack, or for folks with COPD, having breathing problems. And those are pretty well known and well documented. But what isn't as well documented is the effects of long-term exposure to low levels of these contaminants. So if you live near, or go to school near, work near, worship near some of this kinds of gas infrastructure, what kind of cumulative risk do you have from breathing these things on a daily basis? And we know that some of this chronic exposure can lead to serious health complications like cancer and COPD, things like that. But what does that mean for for these kinds of gas infrastructure when we don't have the answers. We can't directly correlate emissions from a particular location to these health impacts. Next slide, please. So here, Kim mentioned compressor stations and what they do. So their job is to push the gas through the pipeline. But as you saw in those FLIR images, they're releasing constant emissions. And you can see here the kinds of scales that we're looking at. So on the left is the Stony Point compressor station, not far from where OWL lives and the RAMAPO LENAPE live now. And on the right is just kind of a stock image to give you a closer up view of the scale of these things. And they are releasing gas all the time under normal operations, but sometimes they have blowdowns, which are when they need to rapidly vent the gas in the pipeline. And these can release high levels of contaminants and gas. And while we call them, say, like an accidental blowdown, the industry likes to call them unplanned releases. And these are not necessarily measured in what they have to tell regulators in terms of the emissions. And they're also really important because unlike, say, a normal day, if you have folks living very close to this kind of infrastructure, there's a blowdown releasing massive amounts of methane and contaminants. What does that do to folks living in the area? And which way does the wind blow? And right now, honestly, there is no law saying that these pipeline companies have to notify communities when these blowdowns happen. Next slide. So here's an example. We were saying about what happens when there's a release. So you're just looking at two different screen grabs of a group that went, they mounted a detector to a car and they drove it around downwind of two different compressor stations. Those are within the small circles. And what you can see is that the areas around the compressor station, they can detect very high levels of methane, well above what are allowable levels for release. But if you are looking at a snapshot from a single day, because that's what was reported to you by the pipeline company, and you multiply that by 365 days to measure emissions, that doesn't capture these kinds of events, which is what happens directly downwind depending on weather conditions or depending on operating conditions for the pipelines. So you could imagine if your home was in that area with extremely high levels of methane, and we can assume other contaminants found in fracked gas, you could be experiencing some of these acute effects, but also exacerbating your chances of experiencing those more chronic effects. Next slide, please. So here's another piece of infrastructure that you find on pipelines. This is called a pigging station. So within the pipelines, you can get a buildup of what the industry calls black powder. This is actually considered a radioactive hazardous material because fracked gas contains radon. And as the gas travels through the pipes, that radon decays into polonium and lead and other contaminants. And it gets cleaned out, and you can see on the upper right that kind of black powder coming out of the pipeline. And on the bottom right, you can see in that tiny little white circle, that was a proposed location for a pigging station in Carmel. And you can see how close it is to other homes. And imagine having that kind of contamination in your area. Next slide, please. The other is metering and regulating stations. They control the flow of gas in the pipeline. They also routinely vent and leak gas. One of them is 900 feet from my house. Next slide. And these are the levels of emissions expected from this. And it's considered a minor emitter, despite the billions of tons per year that it emits. Next slide, please. And here's imaging of the same FLIR camera showing that routine leakage from a metering and regulating station. Next slide, please. So the different routes of exposure, you can imagine, inhalation is one of the most worrisome, but also if you have plants in your garden, ingestion could be a concern. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, if you just multiply a single day's emissions by 365, you miss those high levels that can happen over a short duration. So you can see here, this is a graph of hydrogen sulfide emissions from a compressor station. And you can see how it changes. It is definitely not a constant rate of release. And so if you wind up being outside or breathing in air during that kind of peak release, you could feel those acute effects of hydrogen sulfide exposure. Next slide, please. So a lot of folks kind of think, well, if it was that dangerous, the government certainly wouldn't allow it to happen. Like they would do something, they would limit this emission. And actually, they really don't. So one, they rely on pipeline companies to report the data themselves, which is not reliable. They don't require constant monitoring, so we could know when those peaks were happening. But as this chronic exposure to pollution, as we understand more of the long-term health impacts, we can see that basically it is limiting our lives. So you're looking here at a graph showing levels of pollution for our area. And in the bottom right, you're seeing what the hazard ratio is, meaning what does that do to your lifespan? And these numbers are similar. I can guess most of you don't go to a tanning bed because you're worried about getting skin cancer. Well, the risks of getting skin cancer from a tanning bed are similar to these risks of death caused by air pollution. Next slide. I think that might be my last one. Yeah, so this is a problem that we have to be concerned about, even when emissions are not exceeding what the law says is allowable. These are concerns for us and for folks living anywhere near any of this kind of infrastructure, especially downwind of these kinds of pieces of infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And I'll move right on to our last speaker for the evening before we move on to the questions and answers, and we'll make sure to keep some time open for that. Our last speaker is Dr. Murray McBride, a professor of soil chemistry at Cornell University. He has more than 40 years of research experience studying the chemical behavior and toxicity of contaminants in soils and the potential for transfer into crop plants and food chains. He has published peer-reviewed journal articles, mostly related to the reactions and bioavailability of trace elements and pesticides in soils. He's been involved for many years in working with community organizations to protect agricultural soils from receiving toxic waste, such as municipal sewage sludge, under the guise of beneficial use. And we're so excited to have him with us today. Dr. McBride.
Okay, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, thank you, Haley. And that's my title slide, Environmental Concerns with Waste Fluids from Deep Gas Well Hydrofracking. So there's been a dramatic growth of shale gas production over the past decade, which we all know. This has been made possible by this relatively new technology of hydraulic fracturing or fracking. But this has led to huge volumes of saline contaminated wastewater called brine, or euphemistically produced water, by the industry. This wastewater, I'll try to explain briefly, presents a serious threat to clean surface waters, to aquifers, and to the land itself. Next slide, Carly. So to drill one horizontal well using fracking technology takes about 11 million gallons of water. This has potential impacts locally on surface and groundwater reserves. And then if we think nationally, the US oil and gas industry now is generating 850 billion gallons of produced water, so-called produced water, that's contaminated water, every year. That is a number that's actually hard to envision. This so-called produced water has very different composition from the water that's pumped down due to the dissolution of salts and radioactive elements from the bedrock itself. The bedrock is black shale. In our area, it's the Marcellus. I have a chunk of it right here. The Marcellus shale contains radioactive elements as well as salts. In addition, there are chemical additives of unknown toxicity and concentration in this produced water. These have been added to assist in the drilling and fracking process. So we have radioactivity, salts and heavy metals coming from the black shale into this produced water. About 30 to 40% of the water used in drilling is recovered and has to be disposed of in some way. That leaves about 60 to 70% remaining below ground. Next slide. And this is just a diagram produced that was created by USGS to show, and I won't have time to describe all the possible avenues here by which an aquifer could be contaminated, or surface waters could be contaminated by wastewater disposal and by leakage from the well itself. But I think the diagram is somewhat evident as to all of the things that could go wrong and have gone wrong, in fact. Next slide. So the fluids generated from these deep wells can be separated into two types. The frac fluids, which are actually created during the well drilling and development, and they are stored on site. And then the brines, which are these highly saline geological waters that are released over time, over a period of years from the well. Now the frac fluids are stored in tanks, typically, or in lined pits. The photograph there actually shows a lined pit in Pennsylvania, where the frac fluids are being stored, at least temporarily. And Pennsylvania is presently, as you may know, is having problems with treating such large volumes of highly saline water. Next slide. What is in these frac fluids? It's a long list, so it's quite a toxic mix. We have surfactants and soaps that are added. That's to assist in the drilling process. Then you have very, very high salt concentrations, particularly sodium and chloride, but also strontium, barium, sulfate, bromide. There can be 100,000 parts per million chloride or higher. So these are extremely salty waters, toxic to soil, actually. And then there are radioactive elements. There was some mention in the previous talk about radioactivity coming out of the black shales. Specifically, in this case, it's radium-226 and radium-228, long-lived isotopes that ultimately decay to lead. And then gelling agents are added as well during the drilling, and trace metals, some of them toxic like lead and cadmium, that are released by the fact that well stimulation is done commonly by actually injecting 7 to 15% nitric acid into these wells. So that acid dissolves a number of these heavy metals out of the shale, and that's brought up again in the produced water. And then finally, there are these proprietary chemicals where even the state agencies aren't able to get a complete list of what these chemicals are because they are proprietary, having unknown degradability and unknown toxicity. Next slide then. So what are the disposal options for the wastewater? So here's the problem. There's no obvious way to dispose of these in a proper manner or to treat them. The industry has been injecting produced water into deep wells. You may have heard about earthquakes caused by that. So some of these wastes have been exported out of Pennsylvania to other states where they've been injected into these deep wells. Produced water has been disposed of in New York landfills. Brines have been disposed of in some states by spreading on roads instead of, in place of road salt. And as far as I can tell, our New York DEC still allows this practice, at least as of 3 years ago. There's really no way to treat brine water. People talk about reverse osmosis, but that just creates even more saline water and is a very expensive way. Other than diluting the salinity, there's not a heck of a lot you can do to treat it. The EPA presently prohibits discharge of produced water to surface waters or to municipal wastewater treatment plants east of the 98th parallel, which is a curious rule. That would include us. We're east of the 98th parallel. But at the same time, the fracking industry is presently urging the EPA to allow more produced water to be discharged to surface water and water treatment facilities, even though we know that water treatment facilities don't really treat this waste. Next slide. So in the New York State DEC 1,500-page environmental review that was done some years ago, where they were anticipating that maybe fracking would be done in New York State, in the Marcellus Shale Formation, they had identified 3 disposal options they thought were at least feasible. The first one, truck the millions of gallons of wastewater produced per well to a treatment facility and either discharge that treated water into a river or reuse it for another drilling project. Second option, ship it out of state for deep well injection disposal, as I mentioned a minute ago. Or thirdly, recycle it on site for drilling multiple wells. And some of that is being done, which reduces the amount of waste, but still leaves a tremendous amount of waste to be dealt with. And by the way, that footnote at the bottom, the treatment of this kind of water at municipal wastewater treatment plants has been banned by EPA since 2016 because it simply doesn't work. The municipal wastewater treatment plants are not they don't have the technology, in fact, to treat this kind of waste. Next slide. And this is my last slide. So to summarize my points here, the natural gas produced by hydrofracking is not in any way or shape clean energy. Even disregarding all of the points that have been made by the earlier speakers, the fact that it produces that much fracking waste material for which there's no technology at present to treat means it's a dirty technology. Disposal of this wastewater poses a threat to aquifers, to surface waters, and to the land itself. And that's my talk.
Thank you so much, Dr. McBride, and to all of our speakers tonight. We're so lucky to have such a great panel, and we are running a little bit late on time. Which is amazing because I feel like there's so much more that could be said. There's a myriad of information out there about all of the ways that this infrastructure harms our communities, our environment, our health, how it's exacerbating climate change. And so please do use some of the resources and websites that were named by some of the speakers to check out information on just how harmful this stuff is, and also how you can speak out and get involved and help stop this infrastructure from being sited in your community. But we want to move on as quickly as we can to questions and answers. We'll go for about 10 or 15 minutes or so, so we'll get to as many questions as we can. If we can't get to your question, we'll try to get the questions to our speakers and get you an answer over email at a later time. So this first question is directed to Owl. And the question is, does your tribe submit objections to projects like this in writing? If so, or if not, how do you let your opposition to these projects be known?
Well, we have to be somewhat selective right now in the projects that we take an open opposition to. In terms of writing and analysis, but with our allies like Sane Energy and others, I showed up in many events with Courtney Williams. We work with allies and on policy levels opposing these projects. But our problem, like with many communities, is it's a bandwidth problem. So we do what we can, and I think that's all we can do. And you'll be surprised that you can do much more than oftentimes what you think you can do. Like, if you had told me that what's happening now in terms of infrastructure that's been stopped, a ban that's been passed, I would have probably told you were crazy. I remember what Kim Fracked was talking about in New York, where they were trying to say things like, let's try to kind of just contain it. And people like Kim said, no, we're going to ban it. And that's what happened, or even in a place like Pennsylvania, where they passed rights of nature. I think that's another question. people are saying you should just go ahead and just change zoning laws to say it can't happen here. And then people are saying, no, we don't want it to happen anywhere.
Yeah, no, thank you, Owl. And I think that by combining the forces of so many groups like we have here, the folks that we're working with on the Stop Danskammer Coalition, that's the way we can help stop these, is by all coming together from all of our different points of view. No one individual or group can do it alone. This question, I think, is for Kim, and there were two questions. I'll kind of put them together. One is how many pipelines bring fracked gas into New York? And the other is that Danskammer Energy is saying that they won't use fracked gas for their plant. They're just using the same gas that Central Hudson supplies to all of its customers. And can you speak to those two questions?
I would love to answer that question. Yeah, I read that too the other day, that Danskammer said they weren't going to be using fracked gas, which is a hoot. Because if you check out the You Are Here map, you can see that Central Hudson is directly connected to the Millennium and Spectra pipelines. Spectra is AKA the Algonquin pipeline, which is already insulting enough. But yeah, that's where Central Hudson gets its gas from, and you can track it right to the fracking fields in Pennsylvania. And that's one of the powerful things of mapping all this stuff. They don't want us to see the comprehensive view of it. So you can definitely go to the You Are Here map, follow the Central Hudson line right to Danskammer, and follow where that gas is actually coming from, and just take it right to them and tell them that they're lying to people to get this to pass.
Thank you so much. That was a great answer to the question. And I would love personally to do that, and I would encourage others to do it as well. It's just one of those bald-faced lies that unfortunately are all too common, by these companies that are just trying to get their project. And we're fortunate that there are things like the Frack Tracker map out there where people can really easily access this information that shows that, in fact, they are not telling the truth. So we're lucky to have stuff like that at our disposal. Let's see, the next question, I think, Owl, you wanted to answer this one too, so we'll give you kind of first dibs on it, and then if other people want to speak to it. The question is New York State doing anything about passing a green amendment to the state constitution Bill of Rights to ensure an inalienable right to clean and healthy water and air?
The reason why I wanted to answer that is while I hope other speakers might have more specifics in terms of New York State Constitution. I think New York State, as far as constitutions nationwide, it's a wide variety in terms of how water is treated in terms of rights to water. There is a movement called Rights to Nature, which is Pennsylvania communities there have done a lot of work on, particularly the Center for Environmental Legal Defense Fund. And I mean, I think it's a very promising area. And in some ways, I think what people don't realize is we've already had a revolution in the sense of the Industrial Revolution and these technologies. I mean, the sticking a pipe as many miles underground as they're doing, I mean, that's a revolution right there. And that's the real kind of, in a bad way, a revolution. So I think it does take these kind of initiatives like Rights of Nature to really deal with the revolution, industrial revolution that's already going on. And the speaker, the professor that talked earlier, I mean, that's one of the reasons why people in Pittsburgh got up in arms, is one day they woke up and had a metallic taste in their water and found out that they were dumping fracking waste directly into the water. So that's kind of how they came to the conclusion that maybe we shouldn't do that. Our municipal waste systems can't handle it. But given the technology we have, that's no way to manage our resources, or rather live with the earth. So in terms of rights of nature, I don't think that's been it hasn't been adopted in New York yet. And I'll let others speak to more specifics if they have that. Thank you.
Thanks, Owl. And maybe I'll just really quickly say that actually last year, the New York State Legislature did pass a green amendment to the Bill of Rights, but in order to go to a referendum vote, which is how new amendments must be added to the state constitution, it has to be passed again by the legislature next year in 2021. So if that happens, it will go on the ballot in the fall election in 2021. So be on the lookout for that. Hopefully it does happen. We'll have to see. The next question is probably for Courtney. how often do compressor stations need a blowdown, and what kinds of sicknesses are evident in those communities that are nearby nearby the compressor stations, and is anything being done about that?
So I guess it's hard to say how often they happen because oftentimes they're in response to something going wrong with the pipeline. So if there is an overpressurization, they would need to vent the gas. If there was a need to do maintenance on a line, they may need to vent the gas. So they really don't, that's I think why they have the jargonish term unplanned blowdown, because a lot of the times it's basically an emergency situation where they vent the gas to avoid an overpressurization. And so we have fought here in Westchester and elsewhere to try and at least get them to notify communities that it's happening, because we have a member of our group who has COPD, and basically every time there's a blowdown, if she doesn't stay indoors with her windows closed and everything, she winds up in the emergency room with breathing difficulties. But there's no law to mandate their alerting, like, you know, they don't use reverse 911 or anything like that. And as for the health effects, you know, we have, and the community around the Minisink compressor station has done a lot of work on this, documenting these health impacts, things like coughing, itchy eyes, nosebleeds, you know, trouble breathing, asthma attacks. When we had work done on the pipeline here in our community, a mom from my kids' school, both our children had asthma, and they both had an asthma attack that correlated with one of these gas releases, and they're not even near a compressor station. So the acute effects are much easier to document, because you can really say, you know, the blowdown happened on Tuesday at 1 o'clock, and at, you know, and on Tuesday at 1:15, I needed to use my inhaler for an asthma attack. So those kinds of things, it's most often effects on the respiratory system, but things like headaches and other things like that have also been documented. But it's the long-term consequences that we don't know and haven't been able to document to the same extent. And I think part of that is because we don't even have real-time monitoring of what's being released. So how can we attribute you know, a health impact to a blowdown or releases from gas infrastructure if we don't have a measurement? It's also kind of obnoxious that always these regulatory bodies say that these effects can be mediated. But if you don't measure what is happening, how do you know that you can mediate the effect?
Yeah, no, it's so horrible to hear about all of the illnesses that people are having nearby these compressor stations, these power plants. I've heard similar stories from folks who live nearby the relatively newly constructed CPV power plant, and it's so scary. And if folks are interested in sort of delving deeper into that and learning a little bit more about it, we did a webinar back in early May, specifically on Danskammer and natural gas and public health. And Dr. David Carpenter of the SUNY Institute for Public Health and the Environment spoke at length about just this issue, and then specifically also about how it can impact outcomes for COVID-19 as well. So that's available on the stoptheplant.org website under the webinars tab if anyone is interested in delving deeper into that specific issue. Let's see, I think we've got time for another one or two, depending on how lengthy they are. So another question is, and I think anyone can answer this one maybe, are there any estimates out there for methane leakage rates in New York State?
Yeah, I think I typed an answer to that. I know we're working with EDF in some of the utility rate cases in New York State right now to, I mean, Sane Energy Project's drive is just to halt all fracking infrastructure. EDF is a larger organization that's working with Google Earth right now, and they're doing methane tracking. But I think that was Steve Fox that asked that question. Steve, I can follow up with you tomorrow and ask EDF if they have like a comprehensive New York view. I know Courtney and I tried to get them up to Peekskill, where she lives near a meter and regulating station. We were excited that they were doing this methane tracking, but it never really followed through. I can't remember we had a whole, like, we were going to see them in 2 months, and then something didn't happen. So I'm not sure that they've tracked all of New York State yet.
Thank you. And I see that a lot of questions have been answered on the Q&A tab. So if folks haven't looked, they can look there. Thank you, everyone who's been answering questions on there, because we are short on time. There's one specific question that I don't think has been answered that we can answer quickly. It wasn't my slide. I think it was Kim's, but it was, what are the roots of ingestion? It was ingestion, inhalation, and what was the other one? Absorption. Absorption was the other one.
That was my slide. What was the question?
Courtney, sorry. It was
Yes.
about what were the 3 roots of exposure?
Yes. So for a lot of this kind of infrastructure, inhalation is the route that we mostly focus on, because it's air pollution. And if you breathe it in, obviously that's how it would have an effect on you. Ingestion is, say, for gardeners or farmers, so around the Cricket Valley fracked gas power plant, that is arable farmland. And if you have, like, some of these components contribute to things like acid rain. So then whatever that contaminant is settles on plants, and then it's eaten by you or eaten by animals. So you can ingest these kinds of things. And the other was absorption, which is kind of through the skin. So if that's not necessarily a very obvious way for you to come in contact with this kind of thing, maybe with the pigging stations where there is that dust and debris removal, or especially during construction activities, fugitive dust is a major, major problem. And so that would be a possibility for an absorption route where the dust, if it's on your swing set, if it's on your bicycle, it's on your front steps.
Thank you so much, Courtney. And there was another question that I think I'll wrap up with, and this is bringing it back home to the Danskammer project itself, which is a project that is in the very early stages of review by state agencies. And the question was, what additional environmental hurdles or process does Danskammer have to go through before it can actually get built? And the good news there is that we are at the very early stages of what's called the state's Article 10 power plant siting process. And there will be many opportunities for folks to weigh in with their opposition. Again, the plant.org website, there are numerous ways that you can weigh in with the siting board, with the governor, with your state and local representatives, and let them know that you don't want this plant. There'll be at least a year, probably closer to 2 years, before a decision is made on whether this plant can go forward. And we are very hopeful that New York will continue in the vein of its recent decisions not to permit major fossil fuel infrastructure. And we're hopeful that will continue with this plant, but it's not inevitable by any means. All right, well, thank you all so much. Again, if there are questions that didn't get answered either live here on the screen or in writing on the Q&A feature, we will try to follow up with answers to those as best we can. I think we got most of them. Thank you everyone for joining. Please do keep your eyes open for an announcement of the date and time of our final webinar in this webinar series, which will be next month. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you all there again. And again, we will send out a recording of the webinar and a list of all the websites mentioned by all of the speakers so that you have a chance to go visit them and delve into them more when you have time. Thank you very much.